Sure. Brian Cunningham, District 43 in Brooklyn, which is Central Brooklyn, Flatbush, Crown Heights, Prosper Lefferts Gardens. I serve in the lower house, obviously, and serve in the Agriculture Committee, Banks, Codes, Consumer Affairs, Transportation, and Veterans.
Sure, and I'm Parker Moore. I represent Alabama's House District 4, which comprises Morgan, Limestone, and Madison counties. I represent 4 out of the top 10 largest cities in the state of Alabama, the only legislator in Alabama that represents 4 out of the top 10. And I serve on transportation, utilities, and infrastructure. I'm the vice chair of fiscal responsibility, and I serve on boards, agencies, and commissions. I would say one thing that kind of surprises people is we have the most navigable waterways out of any state in the entire country. And so we have just recently created an Inland Ports and Waterways Committee that handles a lot of the interstate waterways. And one of the major ports is in my district, in the Port of Decatur. And we have a lot of national security stuff that goes through our ports via missiles from Redstone Arsenal or rockets that go from NASA, like the Artemis rocket that we're sending someone back to the moon with is built, part of it is built right there in my district, and we ship it through the locks in the Tennessee River that comes on down and out to the coast of Kennedy.
I think one of the things you said that people don't realize is New York City is 5 counties out of 62 counties in the state. And out of those 5 counties look very different from the rest of the state. People believe that New York's economy is based on our strongest economic engine is Wall Street. It's actually agriculture, right? So those things are very different, and I think that has given me a perspective as a state lawmaker, not only to govern from the perspective of what we do affects the 5 boroughs. We have a city council and a mayor who focus specifically on the 5 boroughs. My responsibility is to look at the state in its totality from Buffalo to Brooklyn, right, and think about how the most northern part of the state is affected by our public policy and how New York City, where I represent, is impacted and what we drive economically for the state. So I think that's probably a big misconception that all lawmakers in New York City or in New York State are really focused on just the quality of life of the 5 boroughs. I would have to say some of the policies that are most divisive are probably criminal justice reform. And I think there's a tug of war between these ideas of what justice looks like and what equity looks like. And this idea that Democrats are soft on crime versus trying to repair harm done from previous pieces of legislation that we're trying to rewrite. So I think that's probably one of the biggest tug of wars. The second one is probably housing policy. Again, New York City is the 5 boroughs. It is probably the most expensive place in the country to live. It has soaring higher rent costs, but it also has a deeper concentration of people than upstate New York. So when you talk about zoning and how do you rezone particular localities across the state to create more housing so that we have population that feels comfortable living upstate and have industry to support them where they work upstate and infrastructure that supports water and other infrastructure needs, I think those are the 2 things that we kind of get lost in and get divided on. I think for the most part, everything else is pretty much people find a way to the middle, but on those 2 things I see that people run to the furthest extremes of our parties at times. You know, one of the things that I've tried to do is I've tried to find common ground in the things that we mostly agree on. Myself, I've been known as one of the most bipartisan Democrats, even though we are in a supermajority. 103 Democrats in our state, about 47-52 Republicans in our state. What we've done is literally find the areas where we can work together on, and when those areas come up that are disagreements, I become a negotiator in those conversations because I've built goodwill and faith on other things that I was able to push through, help foster. So when we need a deal made, I can go over to the other side and say, look, we've worked together on X, Y, and Z. We really need your support on X. We have the votes, but we don't want to do this in a fashion where we're rolling people. We want to make sure that people feel like they've been included, and some of their ideas are included in amendments or the legislation. One bill specifically was a Republican-sponsored bill called Melody's Law, which is a domestic violence bill, literally authored by a Republican in the Hudson Valley. That was a regional bill for a woman who was impacted by domestic violence. I literally said to him, is it important the bill gets passed, or is it important that you make a point of holding the bill? He said it was important the bill got passed. I said, I will author the bill, reauthor the bill. I'll introduce it. I'll make you my co-lead sponsor, and we'll pass the bill. That bill was bipartisanly passed. We had one no vote on the floor. The governor signed it. Melanie's family felt like there was a sense of justice, and I think that for a lot of even the newer Republicans coming in this year, one of their first questions to their caucus leadership was, who's Brian Cunningham? And they wanted to meet me because they knew that I had a history of not just talking about bipartisanship, but actually taking the issue. That allowed me now to, again, be a negotiator on bigger, more substantive things, and to be someone that they looked to when it was tough to take a vote, to say, let's have a conversation and figure out, can we get this amendment?
I would say we're probably a little unique. A lot of, I would say 85 to 90% of the legislation that we have on the floor is unanimous across the board. But I want to kind of piggyback, I guess, off of what the representative over here said. I think when it comes to divisive issues, criminal justice reform or sentencing reform is an area where we kind of disagree on, and we have more of a discussion on the floor about some of those different pieces of legislation. And I will say that a lot of our discussions and compromises come throughout the summer. And so we work extremely well across both sides of the aisle on the issues. And a lot of that is ironed out before we ever even get to the floor. So there's not a lot of heated discussions that happen, but occasionally those will churn up. But I would say definitely probably sentencing reform, split sentences, things of that nature are what causes the biggest flare-ups on the floor, if you will. I don't hear very much from within my district in regards to the sentencing reform. I would say it's more of my colleagues across the aisle that are actually sitting down and saying, this is the way that I see it, and this is why it's affecting the people in my district this way, because I don't have the same type of demographics as some of my legislative colleagues on the other side of the aisle have. So it gives me a whole different perspective and understanding of where they're coming from, because I don't see it that way. I would say that in Alabama, it has surprised me at how similar a lot of our thought processes and ideologies actually are, and how much common ground there actually is in terms of legislation, because you see the national media and how people don't get along across party lines up in D.C. In Alabama, it's not really that way. A lot of the thought processes and where we want to get to is very similar, and that's why I think that you see about 85 to 90% of the legislation that we bring is 105 to nothing across the board. And I attribute that to, if you have an issue or bringing legislation that could potentially have an issue, you go talk to those individuals that might have an issue with it, and you work on that throughout the summer. And so I would say there's a lot of bipartisan effort on both sides of the aisle if we bring legislation to work together to find that common ground before we actually even drop that legislation. I would say relationships across the board, doesn't matter what political party affiliation, are very important. Because if in the realm of politics, if you make enemies, you're not going to get anything accomplished. So it's important to build those relationships and also build that trust with all of your legislative colleagues. I've had legislation before that I've brought that if I didn't have all of the Democrats that carried over their vote and voted with me, would not have passed, because I had so many Republicans that abstained on a particular piece of legislation. And so building those relationships, I think, carries a lot of weight. It was expanding curbside alcohol delivery. So during COVID, right after COVID, I brought a piece of legislation that would allow someone to go and pick up to 2 cases of beer or 4 cases of wine and have it brought out to your vehicle without having to go in because of COVID. And I had a lot of my legislative colleagues that were anti, and so I had all the Democrats supported me on that, and it actually is what carried it over to pass. We've got a fraction that doesn't want alcohol, period, and they're anti any kind of expanding that opportunity for people in our state, and so I wouldn't say it has really made very much of a difference.
Yeah, well, look, back in 2022 when I was elected, we started a group chat. There was 5 of us who got elected in a special election, called ourselves a special caucus because we were in special elections. Since then, we created a group chat, and we've invited new members since then, which the group is now about 45 members since 2022 that have been recently elected. One thing we stress to them is the fact that while we are the majority party in a state of 22 million people, the Republican caucus still represents 6 million people across our state. And your message as Democrats can't be that we leave no one behind and exclude 6 million people, disregarding their opinions, their votes. The other part for me is that there's perspective you gain from listening to counter arguments. I think Abraham Lincoln was a genius with this. He had this idea of a team of rivals, where his cabinet didn't look like a homogenous group of people. He had different perspectives, people who'd push back. I think in our own kitchen cabinets, politically, we want people to tell us no when we're running. When you're doing legislation, you want to kind of see around the corner what the arguments might be. I am infamous for introducing a bill, going to the floor leader and saying, what's going to be the arguments that you have? And I've had that respect with former member Goodell, who was a brilliant floor leader for the Republicans, and now Mary Beth Walsh, who she and I have debates on the floor, and debates that is spirited in her principles, but we've always had a respectable understanding of what I'm looking at, how I can change language, or how I can think about those ideas differently. We've changed each other's minds on a few things. I think just having that perspective is very critically important. I'm in the first half of the second year, so next year for us is an election year.
Okay. And we're 4-year terms, and so I'm entering my 4th year. So 2026 is an election year.
You guys are lucky. 4 years. Love that for you.
Yeah.
Every 2 years, man. Well, for me, 2 things came up for me. The first part was just more personal. I just had a 19-month-old son, and have my wife back home. So every time I'm in Albany, 160 miles away from home, I always say make the time count. Because I'm missing literally those first moments with my son. I almost missed his first steps. I came home just in time to see it. So for me, it's not really playing around in terms of being in Albany just to goof off. The second piece is the urgency of the housing crisis. So I have a bill called Faith-Based Affordable Housing. This is probably one of the bills where me and my colleagues on the other side will have fierce debates on, because my guiding star is that people across the state, not just in New York City, need to develop housing stock for people throughout the state. That's something I'm very interested in, very fired up about. I want to see that completed, as well as moving our state resources when we give state subsidies for housing, to ensure that that looks at community median income and not just the larger average median income. In New York City, for instance, the incomes in New York City, Westchester, Long Island are much higher than the rest of the state. And if we're building housing just based on those higher incomes, we'll never include working class people, blue collar workers who need housing, police officers, firefighters, teachers, and like. So I think for me, housing is probably the most important thing, which drives, I think, a national conversation of affordability, which we're seeing the echo chambers of that in New York City right now, even at this moment.
I can completely relate. I've got a daughter that was born my first day of my first year in session. Oh. So I was down in Montgomery. Wow. And got a call that said she was going into labor, so I had to turn around and drive home for my very first vote. I didn't even get to cast it. And then my son was born 3 weeks before my 3rd year started.
Wow. Glad you caught both.
Yes.
That would have been bad.
Made it back. So, yes.
Talk about votes you want to miss.
Yeah. I would say a lot of, based on the discussions yesterday that brought to the forefront, I serve on the Joint Mental Health Task Force and the Opioid Settlement Commission in Alabama. And so mental health is a passion of mine. And I serve on the board of directors for the Mental Health Association in Morgan County, where I live. And so helping expand access to mental health opportunities for people, I think, is something that is desperately needed in our state, especially among some of our youth. And we, about 3 years ago, we allocated funding for at least one mental health professional in every school district in our state. And it's also a resource that is available to our educators. And so now we are working on providing mobile crisis units to reach out to some of our underserved rural communities to help provide greater access and opportunity for them to seek treatment and help. And I think now we are starting to try to push towards long-term mental health care facilities because we do not have any in our state. About 15 years ago, under a different administration, they cut a lot of funding because we didn't have a major issue with it. And a lot of that was because of mental health. And then when COVID hit, we saw a huge uptick in mental health, primarily among some of our youth. And so that's what we've been rapidly trying to catch up, and we've allocated a little over $330 million back into the Department of Mental Health to try to provide access to get those that need help. And I think that one area that we're looking, that we were sending people to, is either to the hospital and they were getting drugged up and then putting back out on the street, or they were getting sent to jail and the police officers were not equipped to handle all of the things that come along with trying to diagnose and properly handle mental health. So we've allocated more funding for mental health training in our law enforcement. About 40% of our state prison population suffers from some form of mental health. So we have allocated a wing. We're building a new updated prison for our state, and one whole wing of that prison will be dedicated towards mental health, which will have dedicated mental health professionals to get them the help and treatment that they need while they're serving their sentences as well. But I think continuing to push and to allocate funding and provide those resources for those that are struggling, not only just mental health, but with addiction in general, I think is something that really hit home with me, because I've got a lot of family members that have dealt with similar situations, but also the discussions yesterday really kind of hit home with me on that, and making sure that I continue to push and to prioritize to get those individuals the help that they need.
And just that was a crystallizing moment for me, because I just carried a bill to do the same thing, create mobile health services in the state of New York for youth specifically, because we were allocating a ton of money in capital to mobile vans to different criminal justice organizations who identified that as an issue. Mm-hmm. And now we have a wider spread pot of money going throughout the state, so individual members don't have to bear that burden. So it just shows the interconnectivity of not only bipartisan legislation, but what's happening in different states across the country, and how we're more the same than different. Mm-hmm. And this idea that criminal justice is what happens when people get in for sentencing or for serving time, it really starts at, one, we know that people who have mental health issues are 10 times more likely to be a victim of crimes than commit a crime. But we do know over 80% of our prison population also suffer from mental health issues. And addressing that on the front end will, I think, limit some of the debates on the back end of criminal justice reform, because we're addressing the root cause, which is the mental health and the economic well-being of people.
See, and we've discovered that we've got a vast majority of our mental health patients are veterans. And so we have created veterans courts and drug courts, which are separate from our regular court systems. And I brought a bipartisan piece of legislation this year that allows, we've started kind of a program while you're incarcerated to where you can obtain an occupational license, get training in a field that can help you be more productive when you get out. But where we fell short was actually providing the credentialing, the ability to get the credentialing after you finish serving your term. Mm-hmm. And so my bill that I brought was for nonviolent felons and non-sexual offenders that will allow the Department of Corrections to issue a certificate of employability for these incarcerated individuals. When they get out, they can petition to get a job in a career field that was not what they were incarcerated for. Mm-hmm. So if you were incarcerated and got a felony for embezzling money, you couldn't go get working for a financial institution, but you could go get a heavy equipment operator's license or something along those lines. And it's going to help spur job opportunity, because what we're seeing in Alabama, our state unemployment rate, the average is around 2.8 to 3.4%. And so we're struggling to find employees in certain industries, and this helps open up that opportunity for some of those individuals to get a good quality paying job, because that's one of the things that we've found out is a lot of them, after they're out, we've got a felony, so we can't do anything with our lives anyway, so it doesn't matter if we get another one. They just fall back into the same repetitive cycle and system. So by doing this, we're hoping that it will provide them an opportunity to get back on their own feet and earn an honest living and be able to raise a family.
Yeah, we passed that bill 2 years ago called Clean Slate, and it was heavily demonized that it was a package to give a free pass to people who were formerly incarcerated. So it's just so interesting how when you sit next to each other and you have conversations rather than floor performances that we sometimes have in our respective parties, that you can actually find the root cause of some of the issues, and actually we're seeing more of the same things. It's just how we message things and how we promote things and who packages it and who sometimes is in the majority versus who's in the minority, and how that gets lifted up to actually getting something to the floor and passed. It's going to do something meaningful for somebody.
See, I had the minority leader in the Senate carried it upstairs, and I carried it in the House, and the minority leader and about 6 of my colleagues, we all co-signed on, or they co-signed or co-sponsored it with me.
Yeah.
So it was a good bipartisan piece of legislation.
It's great.
Well, for me, I would say it's the ability to build relationships with individuals that I otherwise would not have, and to hear their perspectives and what challenges they're facing in their states. Because one thing I've realized by talking to all the representatives and senators that are here is all the states are very similar in their issues, and understanding how they're dealing with stuff compared to how we're dealing with it, and how we might be able to interweave and help each other in that regard, I think is what's really stood out to me. And also building those bonds. We've been able to exchange contact information and exchange pieces of legislation, even across party lines, and I think that's very beneficial.
I would have to agree and say that what's happening behind us, literally in terms of the Capitol that sits behind us, isn't happening in state houses across the country. And when you get people in a room who aren't flying in and flying out very quickly and spending meaningful time having meaningful conversation, and the cameras aren't always on, and it's not always this TikTok X culture, because you can't really summarize it in 60 seconds or 160 words, that people can really have meaningful conversations, find commonality. And I think if we focus, I think when the speaker said it, yes, if you focus on the majors and not the minors, we could actually walk with a lot more done. So this to me was crystallizing. It was impactful, important, and just seeing people from the same party who are struggling with issues and people from different parties says that we're all in this together, and we're all trying to make our cities, our states, and our country a little better.